All right, hello everybody. We are moving on to the Unit 2 lecture, which is titled Empires and Enlightenment. We are going to look at how the foundations of empire that we discussed in Unit 1 are going to really shift and change as we move closer to independence, through independence, and consider how empires are really developing and changing in Asia as well. So, course logistics, again, as a reminder, y'all need to submit your Unit 2 reading reflections by the last day of the unit. They need to be in a single file. Upload them as one file. The readings for this unit do not completely follow numerical order. Please pay attention to this. We are reading chapters 26, 27, 28, and 30, and we are saving chapter 29 for next unit. Those four, 26, 27, 28, and 30, fit together more historically, and we'll save chapter 9 for next week. At the same time, you should be starting to think about completing one of your history in detail videos using the objects and images that accompany each unit from that sort of historical period that we are talking about. A reminder about our note on lectures. This is not, a complete sort of follow along with what you will be reading. I'm obviously synthesizing information. It's supplemental to your readings, and you should really use your lecture guides and your reading reflections together for an overall understanding of the unit. So let's get into today's agenda. We're going to first look at transformations in East Asia. We're going to look at how Asian empires sort of developed at the same time that sort of empires in the Americas are growing. We're going to look at how the Americas grew restless under colonialism, and then we're going to look at how sort of independence arrived to the Americas. So let's start off in Asia. So although we talked about, especially in Unit 1, how Asia did participate in long distance trade with Europe, right? There were established trade routes. There were both on land and overseas trade routes, particularly, right, going from the Philippines to Mexico. So there was a very clear relationship between Asia, Europe, and the Americas in terms of trade. However, the continent remains largely closed off to foreigners until the 19th century. So during this time, basically just up until that sort of opening starts to happen, China serves as the most dominant power in Asia until the late 18th century. So they remain that sort of dominant key power in Asia, sort of throughout the entire sort of early modern period that we talked about in Unit 1. In particular, the Ming and the Qing dynasties established very strong imperial states that focused on stability and maintaining a solid agrarian society. That means that they focused on sort of maintaining very strong agriculture and agricultural production. So let's talk first about the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty rules in China from 1368 to 1644. So that is quite a large sort of span of time. And under their rule, they create a very tight centralized state. There will be an intense focus on preventing invasions, and that includes building the Great Wall of China. So there is this like very clear anxiety or fear of preventing any sort of overland or sea invasions, thus resulting in stronger fortifications like the Great Wall of China. The Ming Dynasty does ultimately decline due to, despite their best attempts, pirates, right? They do sort of invade China at the time. There is widespread sort of political corruption, and the area is hit with a famine, right? So they're really like coming up against both external and internal factors that lead to the Ming Dynasty's decline. Now, with the decline of the Ming Dynasty comes the Qing Dynasty. And they rule from 1644 until 1911, which is essentially when China opens up to foreigners. They are established, and this is important, right? They're established by a Manchu ethnic group. So they are not necessarily, so under the Ming Dynasty, would not have been considered quote unquote Chinese, right? It would have been sort of a separate ethnic cultural group known as the Manchu. They are respected by the Chinese because of their military might and their knowledge. So with the decline of the Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty comes in. they do maintain a very strong centralized state, but they focus on that administration through sort of Confucian scholars as bureaucrats, right? So, sort of religious scholars that become very important bureaucrats. And they, in particular, create the establishment of an exam system to allocate these, administrative bureaucratic positions that also ends up promoting education throughout China. Because there is this sort of merit-based exam system that can place these scholars in sort of political positions. So while China is sort of shifting between rulers, between sort of the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty, Japan is undergoing its own changes. So from the 14th to the 16th century, Japan is experiencing near constant civil wars between regional shoguns. And basically, a shogun is like a military governor, or sort of a military leader in charge of a particular region in Japan. And essentially, they're having regional conflicts between each other to try to gain land, gain influence, gain territory, etc. So until sort of the 16th century, there are constant civil wars, constant battles, constant war. Until 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu establishes a military government, and the Tokugawa dynasty rules until 1867. So, really, Tokugawa establishes a very sort of stable, although it is still a military focus, it is a stable sort of political dynasty that rules and sort of ends this near constant civil war and establishes a sort of stable rule in Japan under Tokugawa. What is their goal? And this is going to be known as the Tokugawa shogunate, which is sort of a very sort of golden era in Japanese history. Their goal is really to stabilize Japan by controlling regional leaders and foreign relations. So not only are they trying to keep all those shoguns in place, right? We don't want them breaking out again in civil war, but now we need to also build relationships with other leaders, other countries. No longer are we just constantly fighting each other. So under Tokugawa, you can imagine there are a number of changes that lead to that very sort of long-term stability. In particular, there is the increase of agricultural production. This then leads to economic growth, right? If agriculture, if the goods and resources that you're producing is increasing, then your economy is going to grow. If your economy is going to grow, then your population grows as well. So there is very sort of a chain of events that creates a sort of boom in populations, right? And although generally a population growth is positive for a growing nation, it can grow too quickly. And in particular, this rapid population growth throughout the 17th century results in control methods to sort of prevent an unsustainable population. And that sort of takes place through contraception, through promoting late marriage, right? If you get married at a later age, there is sort of less, you know, biological time to have more children, and through abortion to maintain a sustainable population in Japan. At the same time, because no one is really engaging in this intense civil war conflict, right? There has been peace established, there has been stability. That military prestige that had previously been sort of on samurai, on sort of fighting, shifts to intellectuals. And samurai really decline in position, whereas they had been sort of renowned warriors, very, very respected in society. Their role starts to decline, and instead, merchants become more prominent because there's that idea of sort of like intellectual economic trade, right? Priorities are shifting. At the same time, there's the creation of what are called quote unquote floating worlds, which are really unique entertainment locations for theaters, brothels, any sort of aspect for enjoyment, right? That acted as sort of a sphere to escape the formality of Tokugawa culture and engage in pleasure of various kinds. So not only do we see sort of social changes, we see political changes with the sort of decline of the samurai's position, and we also have sort of cultural changes here with these floating worlds. So while the Ming dynasty is declining, the Qing dynasty is rising, and Tokugawa is establishing sort of the shogunate in Japan, there is also much more movement happening in South Asia as well, right? This is very much a period of empires growing, empires falling in South Asia. And this includes the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. Now, how is it so that three key empires are sort of establishing themselves all at the same time? This is because gunpowder transforms their ability to expand and protect their empire. So let's compare these empires together, focusing on sort of the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. So all three of these empires relied on military might, and their rulers viewed new lands as their personal possessions. It's not just necessarily expansion for the sake of expansion, it becomes a very personal sort of crusade, right? Rulers see it as a personal goal that they want to take more land. Now, these emperors tended to rule unilaterally. So that means that they are solely in charge, right? There is not sort of, there may be advisors or councils, but really the emperor is making 100% of the key decisions. And their power is based in Islamic piety and military prowess. You guys can see here how the gunpowder sort of ties into the importance of this expansion because military might, military strength is very a key facet of the identity of these three empires. At the same time, at sort of a domestic level and an international level, they are also focusing on agriculture, much like sort of the Ming Dynasty, and they're focusing on global trade, much like Tokugawa Japan, right? Establishing more and more connections with Europe, with the Americas, and sort of developing that international presence. Despite the fact that Islam and Islamic piety is so key to their rulers, all three of these empires really boast significant religious diversity between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, among others, right? There is the idea that multiple religions can peacefully live together within the same empire, despite the fact that the emperor does rely on sort of a religious presence. So all of these empires are expanding, right? We've got sort of the Ming and Qing dynasties, Tokugawa. We've got all three of the empires in South Asia, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. They're all expanding. However, expansion can't go on forever, right? And as expansion slows and as foreign trade declines, there is widespread economic crisis by the 16th century. In particular, this hits the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, and they become too reliant on European weapons, therefore preventing weapons manufacturing of their own, right? Because they've engaged in all this foreign trade, they start relying on on that sort of trade relationships, on those imported items. At the same time, they start developing sort of corrupt and negligent rulers, right? So there's sort of this idea of complacency as expansion and trade keeps growing and growing. And these rulers avoid quashing political and religious tensions, right? People are getting more and more upset. Expansion is slowing, trade is declining. They're relying more on imported goods. That affects local goods. There's religious tensions, and no one is really doing anything about it. So by the end of the 18th century, the Safavid Empire, in particular, has completely collapsed. Now, the Ottoman and the Mughal empires will remain. They will be sort of much smaller and look slightly different. And we'll talk about the Ottomans in a little bit. But let's move on to engaging with the lecture. So, again, pause me where I am right now. Take a couple of minutes and answer the following question. I want you to compare Eastern and Southern Asian empires throughout the early modern period. How were they similar? What similarities do you see? And how were they different? So I'm going to pause here. All right. So let's move on from sort of the shifting dynamic empires in Asia, and let's start talking about the birth of the Enlightenment. Now, what is the Enlightenment? It is primarily a European intellectual movement throughout the 18th century that addresses key ideas concerning God, reason, nature, and humanity. It is really, if you remember from Unit 1, The idea that the scientific revolution, that different political and moral thoughts are coming about because of colonization, you can think of enlightenment as sort of the next level of that. It really sort of takes on its own personality and begins to really truly question roles of God, reason, nature, and humanity. And it serves as the foundation for revolutionary developments throughout the 1700s. So when we're talking about the revolution in a couple of slides, it's really because the Enlightenment serves as a fundamental basis. Now, it is very much a fundamental cultural transformation that focuses on human progress and greater control over the world. It's really the idea of how can humankind improve and become better, and how can we gain greater control over the world around us. Now, key Enlightenment thinkers include Voltaire, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and Immanuel Kant. All of these sort of thinkers are going to be considering the role of humans, the role of government, the role of sort of society around us, and really starting to sort of shake up established ideas. So let's talk about the ideas of the Enlightenment themselves. The key ideas of Enlightenment included understanding the universe through reason, right? Scientific and mathematic calculations offer the answers, not necessarily God's divine truth. Now, this is a direct sort of growth out of the scientific revolution that we talked about in Unit 1, right? Science and math becomes a priority over religion. At the same time, politics and the social contract become a very key idea. Government is seen more as a contract between rulers and its citizens, and their rights and duties should be clearly defined, right? So no longer is it this idea of an absolute monarchy where the ruler is divinely blessed to be ruling over its subjects and there is no accountability. It's just accepted as is. No, now government becomes an agreement between the ruler and its citizens. And monarchies no longer seem like the only option, like the best option. And really, it is pushing regular subjects, regular individuals to start considering the role of government in their daily lives and how they can participate in and become sort of an active member. Finally, it also sort of highlights individual freedom and equality, right? This means religious tolerance, freedom of speech, and equality against the aristocratic class, right? So now we are starting to see sort of shaking up the established social order, right? The ability to speak for oneself, the idea that there is not this sort of born hierarchy between nobles and commoners, rather that people have individual freedoms and that equality is sort of an inherent right. So you can see then how these ideas would then play out and sort of promote ideas of revolution, right? These religious, social, and political views of the Enlightenment are really threatening to upend these established hierarchies and very long established notions of political order. And in particular, the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinkers really rely on circulating printed pamphlets. And these pamphlets, as they circulate throughout Europe and the Americas, these new ideas of individual liberties, of social contracts, of government contracts, of new relationships between rulers and their subjects, these ideas start to catch on like wildfire. Now, anyone who is literate or anyone who can read out to people just sitting around can start be engaging with these ideas. And revolutionary leaders in both Europe and the Americas will rely on key Enlightenment concepts like the social contract as the basis of their movements against established authorities. So we're going to talk about a couple of American revolutions. Throughout the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, revolution sweeps throughout Europe and the Americas. This includes the American Revolution against the British, the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, and revolutions in Spanish America against the Spanish Empire. We are going to talk about the American Revolution and the Spanish American Revolutions and see how they compare. So let's start with the American Revolution. So in the years leading up to the Revolution, colonists became increasingly tired of growing British taxes and lack of representation in the British Parliament. It's this idea that we've heard over and over, no taxation without representation. So in 1776, the Continental Congress declares independence. They assert that they have natural rights and grievances against the king's rule. Now, the Continental Congress was formed by representatives from all 13 colonies in British North America. After they issue this Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War begins from 1775, with events starting to come out, and then 1783. What is key here is that American patriots rely on aid from France and guerrilla tactics to succeed. That means guerrilla tactics mean that it is small groups. They're getting in, they are getting out. There's not organized formation. That's a hit and run. They know the territory, basically wreaking as much havoc with British troops as they can. So finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed, which ends the Revolutionary War, and it recognizes American independence. So how did it play out in Latin America? Independence in Latin America is really less a result of careful planning and more a perfect storm. There are really four major factors. We have rural social unrest due to new taxes. We have Napoleon invading Spain, which sends the Spanish king into exile. And while the Spanish king is in exile, his own sort of local rulers are starting to be like, hey, well, we deserve more of a prominent role in this new government. If we're going to try to get the Spanish king back, we deserve a more important role. At the same time, colonists in Latin America and Spanish America are getting increasingly upset because peninsulares, which are Spaniards from Spain, are holding all major administrative roles. That is excluding Creoles, who are Spaniards. They're just born in the Americas, but they are seen as less than because they weren't born in Spain. And finally, we have that Creole elites, the Spanish born in the Americas, they decide, hey, it's time for us to seize power from the crown. We want power. It's not necessarily sort of those democratic ideals. It is more sort of everything aligned in the sense that Creole elites were given the opportunity to seize power because of all three of these sort of factors above. Because of this, it really results in disconnected fights for independence. So because the Spanish Empire really ranges from Mexico all the way down to South America, like we talked about in Unit 1, there are really multiple approaches to independence. And primarily, Mexico and South America act as the main actors. So Mexico sort of starts its attempts at independence in 1810, and it achieves independence in 1821 under a wannabe emperor known as Agustín de Iturbide. So he essentially wants to establish a new empire. He is not interested in establishing a democratic government. In South America, they achieve independence in multiple forms throughout the 1820s, but they are primarily led by Simón Bolívar, who is sort of seen as the father of independence in South America. So let's engage with that lecture for the second time. I want you guys to answer this question. How did revolution in British America and Spanish America compare? Take a couple of seconds and answer that question. I'm pausing here. Hit pause. Okay. So let's talk about the plurality of independence. Following sort of the wave of revolutions throughout the Western world, concepts of conservatism versus liberalism start to emerge. At the same time, there are growing calls to abolish slavery with sort of success in independence. So in Spanish America, slavery is abolished, with the revolution or within 10 years after. In Haiti, following their own revolution, slavery is abolished with the revolution. Their independence is really led by slaves in Haiti, rebelling against slaveholders. In the United States, although calls to end slavery increased, slavery is not going to be abolished until the end of the Civil War, almost 100 years after the Declaration of Independence, right? So the Civil War ends in 1865. So as we know, slavery continues in the United States for several decades following independence. So let's talk about the United States immediately after independence. The early years of American independence are really characterized by westward expansion and manifest destiny. What does that mean? That means that the United States is destined to expand across the North American continent to spread its quote unquote superior ideals. It is the idea, and it really is sort of rooted in white exceptionalism in the United States. It is the idea that the United States is destined and deserves to expand across the North American continent because it is superior to all other sort of um, powers, parties, and civilizations in the continent. There is a growing conflict with indigenous communities for obvious reasons. In addition to Manifest Destiny sort of causing conflict with indigenous communities that were already on these lands for centuries, the US government begins to forcibly remove large numbers from their homelands to open up more farmlands for primarily white farmers. Slavery, again, becomes increasingly divisive until the outbreak of the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Unfortunately, in this class, we do not have time to discuss the Civil War in detail, but it did rely and sort of hinge on the idea of slavery, whether slavery should be abolished or whether slavery should not be abolished. And with the end of the Civil War in 1865, slavery was abolished. There's the establishment of the 13th and 14th Amendments, and sort of the beginning of the Reconstruction era. So, what happened in Latin America? Really, attempts at political unity fail quickly, and fragmentation in the smaller states happens almost immediately. Why is this the case? Why is it impossible? Because colonial rule in Spanish America and Latin America fostered strong regional identities to prevent rebellion. Because of this, it was very hard to establish cohesive political units following independence. In particular, peripheral regions, so sort of regions in, rural regions or very far away from colonial centers of power, began to resent those centers of power, such as Guatemala began to resent Mexico City, Chile resented Lima, and it really prevented any long lasting unity in the formation of independent republics. So, what are the main takeaways here? Throughout the early modern world, empires rose and fell based on their specific context. Although China turned inward, empires like the Ottomans looked outward to the point of collapse. In Europe at the same time, new efforts at colonization resulted in centuries of overseas rule of the Americas. However, with the spread of new ideas that sort of developed out of this colonization, as well as growing discontent with the management in both British North America and Spanish North America, American colonies broke free of the yoke of their colonizers to establish diverse, independent states. So take a couple of minutes, make sure you have filled out that Unit 2 lecture guide, and complete the rest of Unit 2 requirements.